Okay.
Okay, guys, I'm
All
here
right.
with I'm here with Paddy O'Gorman. So Paddy is a podcaster nowadays, but he's also a veteran journalist and broadcaster. He used to work for RTE, which is Ireland's version of the BBC. I can hear the boos and hisses already. Paddy,
All right.
I came across your work recently, just a few weeks ago, when you were outside Limerick Prison to
That's
meet
right.
quite a notorious prisoner who has called himself Barbie Kardashian. Do you want to take it from there and
Sure.
tell us why you were out there that day?
Yeah. Well, it goes back nearly 3 years ago when I started hearing stories of men, trans-identified men in the women's prison in Limerick. One of them had also been in the women's prison in Dublin, known as the Docus. And actually, more shocking in ways is the men rather, in women's domestic violence refuges, which is a subject that hasn't been touched at all by the mainstream media. But I came from the mainstream media. I start hearing these stories. I used to use a style. I had a program years back called Queuing for a Living. It's a radio program. You simply would go to queues. I would say, let me think. Your accent is Manchester, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. South Manchester.
Thereabouts. South Manchester. Okay, yeah. Well, I would have made a radio program. Say I stood outside the DSS, Department of Health and Social Security, down the Wilmslow Road. Another time I stood outside one in Great Ancoat Street and just met people, because you had there Irish refugees, you had people from Northern Ireland of both religions who were on the run from the trouble they got themselves into. You had a lot of, say, people who had made a mess of their lives back in Ireland, some who would end up at British Welfare Services, drug and the like. And I also found like working people who were doing their best, but I developed that style of simply going places. So when I started podcasting, it was a style that lent itself to just hearing what's going on, in the world. I made a few television programs. I made one down in Longsight in Manchester.
Oh, right, yeah, not far from here.
Yeah. More or less opposite Longsight Nick. There's a bookie shop called Fred Doan's. About 20 years ago, I took a camera crew there and simply met elderly Irish people. It was elderly men for the most part.
There's a big Irish community there.
Yeah, lovely guys. And they were in their own ways refugees. They'd come as working men to Britain, and many of them had never gone back to Ireland because time and again, they were saved from poorer families who were sometimes looked down on, within the parish. That could happen too. But men who'd become part of the British working class, very strongly Irish still, but for the most part, interesting. Like it's good journalism, but it's good broadcasting to vary voices. And I've always strongly believed in the vox pop, as a way of undermining people who try to speak on behalf of everybody else. So like this thing of transgenderism, I was beginning to hear about it, and I confess I hadn't taken much notice of it. We've had the Gender Recognition Act for 10 years now in Ireland, and I hadn't taken much notice of it when it went through 10 years ago. I wasn't working on those kind of things, but we'd already had this sort of marriage equality thing, or allowing same-sex marriage, and we'd repealed the ban on divorce about 10 years earlier. We'd repealed the ban on abortion. And so that kind of liberal agenda, rolling back the traditional Catholic agenda, was happening. And I think everybody, including myself, just nodded through this gender self-ID thing without noticing it. And then I started hearing these stories. And I said, I can't believe this. So I took myself down and stood outside Limerick Prison for a few hours. It's a system that's always worked for me. I would have done it in outside the Crumlin Road in Belfast or in Mountjoy in Dublin or whatever. And you stand outside a prison, and people will come out who are either signing on for they've been for the last, say, 6 months of their sentence, they have to sign on once a week, whatever, and show they're still engaging with the services. Or people who are visiting, a lot of whom will have previous experience, so will be able to tell you about what's going on. And you get people bringing up a plastic bag looking a bit exhilarated, and they're the ones who are just out. But I met all of those types of people, men and women, because Limerick Prison is mainly a men's prison, but it's got a women's wing as well. And I started meeting people, and a woman saying to me, yeah, I was just in there to see my brother. And that candor, she said, I was a prisoner in there myself. And she said there were 3 trans-identified men in there. And she said...
In the women's prison?
In the women's prison. And actually, the last of them was Barbie Kardashian, of those three at that time, who came out there earlier this month. But the three were a fellow from Dublin, who I'll tell you more about later. He was a man who was the one who wasn't the sex offender, and he had been sent to prison for 3 serious assaults. You know, he had a fair bit of previous, and he'd got 12 months and 12 months suspended. Like that, when nobody knew he was a woman until he came to court. Then when he came to sentencing, his solicitor said, "Judge, my client now has a gender recognition certificate, which you can get in Ireland. I think it's 15 quid. All you have to say is, I now identify as a woman." That is literally all you have to do in Ireland. Accordingly, the court sent him to a women's prison. They sent him to Mountjoy, first of all, to the Docus. And he told me this himself, actually, about a year ago or more ago. He was in trouble there and giving up because he wasn't getting his hormones and he was developing hair. His legs were getting hairy again. And so because of him causing trouble, he was sent to Limerick Prison, which is where they put the bad girls. Once he was down there, I don't know how well he behaved or not down there, but the other two were the sex offenders. One of those was a man who had been sexually abusing his partner's little boy between the age of 3 and 5, something like that. This poor little boy, and he got, I think it was 6 years. He's been out in the last year as well. Our newspapers, the reason I didn't hear about this is our newspapers, our journalists went along with the whole thing of a woman who had abused a little boy. You know, women are doing terrible things now. You know, Stephen, they really are. Sorry, I'm calling you Stephen. I had a friend staying from.
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
Stephen. I've been called a lot worse.
Stephen. It is, yeah. Sorry, yeah, Steve was my mate who was staying with me the last few days over from Gloucester. But this guy had been abusing this little boy. But the newspaper said this woman who had threatened the little boy with pulling his arms off if ever he said anything. This guy, once he came up in court, the solicitor said, "My client now identifies as a woman and has a gender recognition certificate." He was sent to the Limerick Women's Prison straight away. And the third one, the most notorious, is this man who called himself Barbie Kardashian. I think he was 20 by the time he was sentenced, although he'd been remanded for a good year or so before that. He was sent in there for making terrible threats of rape and torture. And he had a lot of previous from his juvenile years. He'd been in trouble really from a very young age. And I think all the information we have is that he did have an extremely unhappy upbringing. You know, that seems to be it. No, that's his story anyway, but he certainly made other people unhappy. And time and again, it was threats of sexualized violence or real sexualized violence against women. On one occasion, he pulled the eyelid off of a social worker. And this very creepy thing with Barbie is when he says things like, "Her screaming was music to my ears," and and you could tell this was an unusual person. Anyway, at the age of 20, I think it was, he finally got sentenced. He was 23 there recently, last December, actually. Sorry, he'd been nearly 24. But he got banged up in the women's prison. Now, just yesterday or the day before, in the Sunday Times Irish edition, the Times of London, we had Leo Varadkar, the former Taoiseach, that is Prime Minister in Ireland, saying gender self-ID has been a great success. Barbie was put in prison, but he wasn't put in with the women. Just before you called me there, I was just sketching down a few notes saying, where does he get it from? Barbie was on the E landing. Which all the women told me the same thing. And it came out when he was up in court last year for making threats of violence against a prisoner and against a prison officer. I went to the court, that was a year ago, last October, and we were shown a diagram. There's the E wing. So E1, there was 2 prisoners in there, 2 female prisoners in cell E1 on the E landing. Next door was Barbie in E2. Next door again in E3, excuse me, next door again in E3 was the bloke we mentioned earlier. I won't say his name even, but I recognized that he's the paedophile. Because the reason I won't say his name is because we can't identify him. But I heard it in the courts when they were giving the evidence. This feminized name. I said, that is a bloke. That's a child abuser. He was there, and I had Varadkar saying, like, there was no contact. There damned well was. Yeah. Now, when Barbie a year ago was in court and he was charged with making threats of rape and violence against 2 women in the prison, a prison officer and a prisoner, they gave evidence and explained, like, the prisoner one stage, defense says, how do you know it was Barbie threatening to rape you and shove those things into you? And she says, because I recognized Barbie's American accent. How do you know it wasn't another woman? I wish she'd said, actually, because Barbie's a man and rape threats from men are much more, obviously more plausible. But that day, that time in the court, that week, the judge, defense, prosecution, all the witnesses could refer to Miss Kardashian. And I'm sitting there looking at this bloke. Of course it's a man. Everybody can see it's a man. But this pretense went on. And then in a verdict, when Barbie was called at the last day of the trial, the 5-day trial, he didn't deny anything. It was the most shocking 20 minutes I think I ever heard in a court when he said, yes, I threatened to rape them. Really gruesome stuff. Oh, I thought I would use the handle of a mop. Because I'm a woman, I couldn't rape in the way that men rape, And no, he is, as defense or the prosecution established, he has his full male genitalia. Oh, but I hate my male genitalia. And he has this slight American accent that it probably got from the telly, I don't know.
Yeah.
And he, I would like to sexually electrocute their genitalia. Absolutely detailed, horrible torture fantasies. And as he said to me when he came out the prison there last week, he says, I didn't manage to rape them. I regret that I didn't rape them, but I did manage to make them cry. I liked listening to the sound of the women crying when he would be So hold on. Women are there's a thing called the Mandela principles, as they call it. You're meant to be sent to prison as punishment. You lose your freedom. You're not to be there to be sexually abused. But what happened? These women are telling me these stories. I don't think that there was certainly not another mainstream journalist in Ireland didn't break their neck looking the other way when I started getting these stories. So I started picking up these stories by November of 22. There was another woman I met who'd only been banged up for a week for tapping on the street, a girl from Ennis in County Clare. And tapping, as that means begging up passers-by, I don't know what you'd call it in Manchester. And like that, she'd been remanded. This is before Barbie was put in there, but the paedophile was there. And she says, I was there mopping the landing, and it was on the E landing. Next thing she hears, this sexualized abuse being hissed out the door at her. And that child abuser, other women said it to me too, he tends to hiss. He's another charmer that women were subjected to. And so I started accumulating this evidence and writing to the prison authorities, phoning the prison authorities. I was treated with rudeness. Okay, I don't care. So do you know that women are being abused in there? And by January, he started picking up criminal charges. And by April of 2023, the Minister for Justice took a decision and removed him from the women's section of the prison. So I felt that was a certain victory, removing Barbie, at least.
Right.
The paedophile was still there. But then you have the former prime minister of this country there yesterday in the Sunday Times saying there was no contact with the women. I'm going to have to answer that guy. I mean, where do they get it from? Of course there was contact. No, we had the minister, she's now the Minister for Health, Jennifer Carroll McNeil, and this lofty solipsism she has when she was replying about this is about a year ago, saying, no woman of my acquaintance has ever been troubled by the presence of a trans-identified man. And now, sorry for laughing. I mean, how damned well removed are these people who are in our government? But as I said, I love the power of the Vox Pop. But once I started getting this story, I started canvassing my old company, RTE, or at least individuals within it, saying, we really need to cover this story that there's women. One of them said to me, no, Paddy, he says, because he was a guy I thought would be able to do it. He says, oh, that story is toxic. Whoa, I mean, since when did journalists avoid a story because it was toxic? Surely. And I think what he means is toxic to his career.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of them like that it's not a good career move. But I mean, I'm deeply disappointed, ashamed even of the journalist profession in Ireland, that they've closed ranks. Now, even when Barbie got out last week, so I'll tell you what, I was morning of October the 1st there, a couple of weeks back. My wife was lying next to me in bed about 6 a.m. She'd woken up, she's reading the early papers. And it was a Limerick-based journalist, David Raleigh, had filed that Barbie Kardashian is due out of prison today. She digs me in the ribs. Wake up, she says, you need to be in Limerick.
How far was that from your house?
What?
How far was that from your house?
Normally, it's about Limerick. It's about 2 hours drive. Now,
Right.
I had to drive because I was too late to get the 7 o'clock train, and I have free travel as an old age pensioner in Ireland. We get free travel. You lot in England don't get that. We treat the old people in that way. We treat them somewhat better here. But which is generally what I used all the week of the trial. I was going up and down in the morning, evenings. Anyway, so I got in the car. I was down in Limerick by about 10, and that was time. And sure enough, there was a photographer there. And there was myself and David Raleigh, who I mentioned earlier. He joined us a while later. The photographer says to me, he says, "How will I know Barbie when he comes out?" I said, "You'll know Barbie. I'm telling you. If he's dressed in his, he was in mufti when he was in court. So this guy comes out with this makeup all over him. He's quite a slight man. He's only about 5'8", I'd say, and his makeup." Very heavy eye makeup, ridiculously bright lipstick, a man's frame. I mean, it's a man, but he had these fake boobs, which were like rugby balls underneath his, yeah. I see you're clicking to it. You see at the top right there, some of those are pictures that I took. Oh, good. I see the Roscommon Herald covered it there. I'd imagine that's probably David Raleigh as well. He was the only other journalist there. But you see the fake boobs on Barbie. He comes over to us. "Hi, are you from the media?" "Oh, yes, I'm Barbie Kardashian." I see some of the pictures I took there as well. "I'm Barbie Kardashian. Yes, of course I want to talk to you, And for the next hour, he stood there. He confirmed everything that he'd said in the court the previous year. So in one sense, I wasn't totally shocked because I'd heard this before. But, all the threats he'd made. I said to him, "Barbie, you made some very bad threats to the women in there. Do you regret that now?" And he says, "I regret," and I thought, "Oh, well, we're going to get a bit of remorse here. I regret not having carried out those rape threats," he said. And the guy just gave, for the next hour, he was more and more horrific and toxic. And I put the most of it up there on my podcast. I took out my phone and I was thinking of my own audio. I thought, gee, I need to get some of this on camera. So I started filming rather sporadically with my phone, and because I'm used to being an audio podcaster. But I sent some of that to the publication Gript, and they used a good 20 minutes or so that they could use. A lot of the stuff he used, you actually couldn't, for legal reasons, put it up there. He was making some very, as he'd done before, well, as another one of his type did to me before, they started making allegations against people that you couldn't stand over. But he made dreadful threats against the two women who he had threatened to rape before. So that rape threat is still on. I should say, by the way, the jury last year acquitted him, which I surprised me. And as Barbie said to me when he came out the court, she says, "I got away with that." His words. I presume in law, what it is, if the threat wasn't considered credible to the people receiving it, but you could find him not guilty, as the jury did on all four counts. But he did make those threats, and he made no secret of it. And well, he did make threats.
That's what I could not comprehend when I was absolutely gobsmacked when I was listening to your podcast from outside the prison there. I was like, this person is just confessing everything that he's going to do. Surely, he doesn't seem to have any comprehension of, saying certain things and what impact that might have even on his own liberty.
Yes. Extraordinary. And he made threats against three individuals: his mom and dad and the prison governor. He all of those things he actually said in court a year ago, not about his mom and dad and the governor, but about what he wanted to do to the women, the detailed ways he wanted to torture these women. That jury sat through the same evidence as I did. I remember getting back on the train to Dublin at lunchtime, and as my train was pulling into the station in Dublin, like 2 hours later, my wife texted me and says, "Barbie Kardashian." And I said, "What?" They just listened to the same thing as I had done, but they did find him innocent. The only thing I can think of, look, if I say, "Steve, I'm going to kill you," and then I get charged for making that threat, it's not a defense. The judge explained this to the jury. It's not a defense to say I didn't mean it. That's not a defense in law. What is a defense in law is to say Steve couldn't have possibly believed it to be a serious threat. And if you can establish that, a jury will let you off. So I'm only surmising. But he came out and he said exactly the same things again. And I did record it all and I published the most of it. because
Where can people find that?
On my podcast, paddyspodcast.ie, and you'll find quite a bit of it on the Gript website, about 20 minutes of video as he's there posing. And it was really, really quite shocking again that, and I put it there because I've had to deal for the last 3 years with people like the former Prime Minister Varadkar saying, oh, but there was no contact. He never had any contact with the women. How do they come up with stuff like this? I had all the kind of, the left-wing politicians, unfortunately, and a lot of the right-wing politicians like Varadkar and Jennifer Carroll McNeil, who I mentioned, all claiming, oh, there's no problem. And we have a lot of our ministers, government ministers now, actually the women for some reason are all dismissing that evidence that the Gender Recognition Act has made any difference. But that's why those men were put in there, was because of the Gender Recognition Act. And my feeling is, look, Steve, we're journalists. Well, our job is meant to be to at least let the public know what's happening. You know, that's our job. Blurt it out. It's not our job to make the world a better place. Instead of that, the media has decided, no, in pursuit of some higher goal, we're going to pretend that these guys are actually women. And even as Barbie came out, our media, including all the papers, any of the papers that took it, referred to Barbie as she. She was accused of making rape threats. There was this pair of journalists tutting about those who won't use the preferred pronouns, in other words, me and a few others, saying, oh, but if a man tells you that he likes fly fishing, and then he says he likes to be known as she, out of politeness, you'll do it. Wow, there's a hell of a difference between threatening to rape somebody and saying you like fly fishing. So to me, once these guys start threatening to rape women or raping women, at what point do you say, actually, they really were men? And this is something that the journalists just won't address. They seem to be they've really let down the public, you know. Where will I go next? Will I tell you about... Will I tell you about the women's domestic violence services? Or you ask me, go ahead.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, go straight into that, because we did that last time. Just to let people know, this is the second time we've done this, because
what happened? Yeah, I'm
we
so
struggled
sorry
with the audio last time, but this is crystal clear this time, Paddy.
Yeah, no, I was looking after a toddler downstairs and running out. Well, my wife was looking after him too, but I came upstairs and I thought, I'll be all right. I'll sit upstairs, but unfortunately, the microphone, I didn't realize how it was getting stuck on my jumper as I was and it kept on interfering with it. And so I'm really sorry about that, Steve. I'll be more careful about it now.
We'll probably keep this to maybe about 40 minutes is normally the good time. So we're just over. You've got about just less than half the time left.
Okay.
Tell us anything else. Yeah.
Well, that kind of works neatly, because the two fronts I've been fighting the gender ideology thing on is on the prisons and on the women's domestic violence shelters. Okay, it was about April of 2023, and my ears were still buzzing with what prisoners had been telling me. But I'm standing at a homeless persons unit in Dublin, which is a welfare service up there in the north inner city. There's a particular Cumberland Street. And Cumberland Street also happens to be the social welfare office to which people are sent immediately on being released from prison. And Mountjoy Prison is only about 5 minutes away. And you can tell the people who are just out of prison because they're holding a plastic bag with their belongings in it. And I started meeting very articulate women, including a woman who was exhilarated. Yeah, I'm just out. And started telling me about prison and I find time and again, drug addicts can be very, very articulate. They remind me of alcoholics. I think they're of above average intelligence on average. You know what I mean? They tend to be. I've always, time and again, they're so articulate. But this woman in her 30s was saying, yeah, I was in the Docas, but we had one, he got sent down to the prison. But she says, in the Novus Women's Hostel in Rathmines in Dublin, there was a trans-identified man. And he's wearing G-strings. This man confirmed to me afterwards, yeah, he wears G-strings. Why shouldn't I? And he's wearing G-strings, but eventually, and the women are scared, because when you have a man in there, the women, they're saying, what is this? But then the guy lost his temper one day. Now, this guy had been one of the people who was in Limerick Prison. Can you imagine? So when he came out of Limerick Prison for 3 assaults, and they were serious assaults, that's why he'd done a year inside, he comes back to housing services in Dublin, and they decided the appropriate place to put this man was in the Women's Domestic Violence Refuge in the suburb of Rathmines in Dublin. Now, like a lot of people from rural Ireland, I lived in Rathmines in the Flatland for many years. I involved myself 40 years ago in fundraisers for that women's domestic violence shelter. It was a progressive cause that women should have a safe place from violent men at the time, or from men, if you like, because you can't always tell who's going to be violent or not. And here we are 40 years later, they're putting men in there. But what happened then? Something probably shouldn't have been too much of a surprise. This man continued to be a violent man. And one day he had a row with a woman in there, a 60-year-old woman of slight stature. He beat her to the ground. He ripped the hair from her head. This big Viking, he's a big mane of blonde hair, muscly guy, good deal bigger than I am now, bigger than Barbie. He'd scare me more than Barbie. And he thumps her to the ground, repeated blows to the head. And the other women fought with him because at least they had the strength in numbers. And the guy got thrown out. He was subsequently charged. Now, he's the only one I know of who's been charged with that assault. And he was convicted in September of 2023. He got a 3-month suspended sentence. By the time he was convicted, he was already back in the Docus, the women's prison in Dublin, for another assault. But he got a suspended sentence then at that stage. Our newspapers, our media wrote, insofar as they covered it, it was woman attacks woman in domestic violence refuge, you know? Yeah. And I'm thinking, well, that's a dog bites man story. The real story, it was a man beat a woman up in a women's refuge because he was housed there. But of course, they ran the other way from it. I wrote to the women's refuge even before it came to court and to Dublin City Council about their housing policy. And I only looked at it the other day. Dear Paddy, thank you for your letter. We don't comment on individual cases. However, we are committed to looking after all women, including women from the LGBTQ plus community who are among the most vulnerable of women. And furthermore, it is inevitable that there are sometimes going to be rows in homeless shelters. Yeah, that's right. But it's not inevitable there's going to be man on women rows. Yeah. And it was just formulaic. And that particular person, she's going up the way now in the housing services in Dublin. Dublin City Council wrote to me and said they want me to know that they're taking training from TENI, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland. So you have these transgender lobby groups who are well ensconced in our housing services, in our prison administration, and they're very effective, aren't they? So this guy, it's a story. To me, that was the really shocking thing about that story. But the lead was buried comprehensively by our journalists. So much so, you still have people like the Taoiseach saying, there's never been any cases of women having been adversely affected. When I say, sorry, the Taoiseach, the former Taoiseach. There's never been any cases of women having been attacked by transgendered men. Yes, there has been. And like any woman, any person would know, it's not just the bloke who's there. If you have men, any woman who's had to live with a violent man will tell you, it's not just when he hits you. The bit where he actually gets a conviction, that's only a fraction. That's the tip of the iceberg, what's really going there. And these men have a lot of evidence on this, not just the guy who got the conviction and says he did it. They are going around, excuse me. I know what a G-string is. What's French knickers, Steve? Do you know?
I think they're big blooming knickers, I think. I'm not quite sure, to be honest.
There's another bloke who goes round. He was in a hostel there down in Parkgate Street near the city centre of Dublin, near Phoenix Park. And he going round in French knickers, the women were telling me.
Yeah, I think they're thrilly. I think they kind of thrilly. Kind of
well, apparently you'd think that would then give you, I know what a G-string is. That would show a bloke's manhood. Yeah. This bloke's going around in French knickers and he's in the women's bedrooms, in the same dorms, because the admin says he's a woman. And there he is in French knickers with his fucking thing sticking out. No, that's and I've learned to believe the women. Of course, they don't make this up. But I am, I think, the only journalist, certainly of the one of a mainstream background, putting this up in Ireland and telling these stories there. So look, actually, when I finish this, I will write a reply to Veronica.
Definitely do that.
Whatever.
Why do you think that nobody else is covering it then? You worked in that industry a long time. Why aren't we talking about it?
Well, I am shocked. I wish I could tell you, Steve. I really wish I could. I wish I could tell you, because it has shocked me the way that they've managed to look away. Because in a way, it's a great story. What I mean by that in the journalistic sense, it's a wow. It's the gee whiz factor that makes a story a story. This is extraordinary. A man beats up a woman in a women's domestic violence refuge. That's the story. That's your lead. A man is threatening women with rape in a women's prison.
That's your
That's
story.
your lead. And but it's not the journalist profession has let down people. Why aren't the trade unions standing up for a female prison officer who was there in Limerick and threatened with rape? That man is out now and he's still threatening her with rape.
Yeah,
Why
they've
aren't the
been
National
captured
Women's
too.
Council? They
Yeah.
have the National
Yeah.
Women's Council, which has a trans-identified man on
There
its
you go.
council. They will never touch it.
Yeah.
And funny,
So-
just a month after that guy beat up the woman in the hostel, there was a man down in Limerick, and we all know his name, Crotty, because he beat a woman to the ground, and then he got a suspended sentence. She ended up being addressing Dáil Éireann, which is addressing the legislature, the Houses of Parliament.
Okay.
Every politician fell over themselves to condemn this suspended sentence. Now, the guy had no previous, so a suspended sentence wasn't that unusual. The guy who beat up the woman in the hostel had plenty of previous. He had previous prison sentences. He was back inside again. He got a suspended sentence. Not a single politician cared. Why? Because the man doing the abuse was wearing a dress. And therefore, they don't want to know. Therefore, you're a bigot or a transphobe or whatever. But that's what's going on. To explain it, I don't know. I am really, really shocked by it, Steve, still.
Yeah, I think
what's going on here?
The lobby groups are so powerful and they've set them up as being the victims. Okay, so if anybody wants to speak out against them, then like you said, the word you use, things like transphobe, things like bigot, you're the bully. Okay, I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware of the Darlington nurses case.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Well, it actually started today. So there's 2 days of readings today up in Newcastle Tribunal Hearing Centre. And then I think the Darlington nurses are there to give evidence from Wednesday. And that, I think there's 8 of them in total that made complaints. And it was by, again, a man identifying as female. His second name escapes me, but he calls himself Rose. Okay. Now, here's something to, once the nurses complained and they were told that by the NHS bosses that they were kind of guilty of wrong think and wrong thought, and they needed retraining. What they were told was the person that they were complaining about was to give them retraining on LGBTQ transgender issues. That's how crazy it got. Now, this guy was really creepy. He used to stand watching them and say, in the changing room, say, "Are you going to get dressed yet? Are you going to get dressed yet? Are you going to get changed?"
Did we fall asleep? Like Rip Van Winkle, fall asleep and wake up, whatever it was it 20 years later? How did this happen? And the way things have shifted, the way this movement has actually shifted, say, women's rights as well, and the ability to tell the truth, is that now the reasonable, moderate position is, let's do it on a case-by-case basis, whether these blokes. So women have to say, why is this particular man not allowed to come in while we're getting changed? What is it about him? Can we make a case about? How about he's a man? Is that not good enough? I don't have a problem as a man staying out of women's spaces, and I don't take it personally because I want women. I want women, whether it be my wife, my daughter, my elderly mom who lived to 94, and she had, a Londoner, she had no time for any of this. I could see, even though she died before it all became well known, I know the way she would have thought about this. She would have said, this is mad, and so women are now expected on a case-by-case basis. These are the moderates. But it's funny how the media is like this parallel universe now. The medical profession is like this parallel universe, using all of these gendered terms and confusing people. I could tell you a story about that too. Our housing services, our judiciary are all in this parallel universe. And excuse me again, what I like about the Barbie Kardashian story is it has actually broken through that parallel universe. There may be a media blackout, or at least a media very strong manipulation or handling of the thing. Barbie, and another recent story was the arrest of Graham Linehan, very well-known Irish comedy writer, and he was arrested coming into an airport in Britain. I think he was coming into Heathrow. again, people heard about that. Now, our media pretended they reported it simply as a news story, when of course it was a story that demanded analysis. Had it been any other Irish writer had been arrested by British police, we would have had column after column about it. Instead of that, it was dismissive. There was one columnist said, oh, somewhere deep down in the article, she says, oh, but of course that many people would share the reasonable concerns. I thought, well, where have you been the last few years? But the Overton window is shifting there because they know people are noticing. Barbie Kardashian's outrageous behavior and Graham Linehan's arrest. People know about that. Now, before Kardashian got out, a few weeks ago, I was up the road in my local pub here, and in Irish culture, probably like British working class culture as well, in a pub, it's not rude to talk to a stranger. If you're at the bar of a pub, it's completely acceptable to talk. And I'm up at the bar trying to get a pint for myself and my wife, and there's two elderly men sitting at the bar, and I hear one saying to the other, but I think Graham Linehan is right.
Brilliant.
So I heard these two guys, and I said, "Hello, man." I said, "I heard what you're saying there. I think Graham Linehan is right." Well, do you? Well, put it there. Now, alcohol makes people a bit less inhibited, but we're three elderly Irish gentlemen shaking hands, and we all agree that men who want to get into women's sports are cheats, and men who want to get into women's toilets are creeps, because that is how decent men think. And now it's funny, sports and toilets, they're the two that are hitting the public imagination, and perhaps prisons now as well. Some of the other stuff about puberty blockers would be more complex, but hopefully we'll get to the worries about that ventilated. But there's signs people are breaking through, and God bless Kardashian. He is so outrageous that and people say, wow, we really subjected women in prison to that, literally a captive group. We subjected them to that. Say that shouldn't be. That shouldn't happen.
Yeah. And I've been doing my best for the last 6 months to, just sing this from the rooftops and raise as much awareness as I can. Part of that is the majority of that is going out on the streets. Part of that is speaking to people like you. I've got a confession to make. Since the last time we spoke, I was kind of like umming and ahhing whether to reach out to Barbie Kardashian, see if he would.
Oh, he'll certainly talk to you.
Here's what happened. So I contacted him, and took a few days, but he got back to me. But all he wanted to do was have an audio phone call.
I see.
And I said to him, well, I mean, I'm doing this for my social media channels. It's visual. Yes. All I do is video chats. And he said that he was a bit insecure about his appearance, and therefore he didn't want to do a video.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I said to him, if you ever change your mind and you want to speak, but I put three things to him. I said, what I want to learn about is your past growing up, your time in prison, and what your future plans are. And I thought that he might be open, and he may be watching this now, and the offer's still there if you want to speak to me. But really, it has to be on a video call like this.
Because once he was back, that day in Limerick, I was actually worried leaving him because the other two journalists had gone, the photographer and the journalist gone. I'm left on the road with him. He's this volatile, angry man. I thought, I can't leave you standing here. I'm actually worried. And next thing, we were joined by two blokes who Barbie says to me, oh, these are my aftercare prison minders. And they were friendly, good-humoured, calm, two calm guys. And I felt so pleased that he's now in good hands. So I've said to Barbie, look, he will be in danger, because if you go around Dublin wearing false boobs, obviously you're going to be noticed. And he doesn't, and people say, oh, we're terrible in danger because we're trans. No, actually, if you go around making yourself noticed and making threats of rape to women and being very noticeable, that's why you're in danger. Or as I've said to, they say, oh, you can't put trans prisoners in men's prisons because they're in danger. No, it's because they're largely sex offenders. That's why they're in danger.
I can give you some figures for that. So this is evidence that was put to a parliamentary committee, and I don't remember the exact figures, but I can give you percentages. So 3.3% of females that are in women's prisons are in there for sex offences. 17.9% of men are in there for sex offences. For men identifying as women, so-called trans women, it's 60% are in there for
It's,
sex offences.
hugely disproportionate. And
60%.
as you know, Steve, it's been no part of our case to try to say when a man puts on a dress, he becomes a special danger. All we're saying is it doesn't make him less of a danger.
Yeah.
Therefore, treat him like any other man, like you or me or anybody else. That's fine. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of empirical evidence that there's a disproportionate number. And I think of it, the 5 I can identify in Ireland who've been trans-identified, the 3 who had the certs that I mentioned, and there's 2 other guys. A guy called Bruno was banged up in the Midlands. Samantha, he was Bruna, he was a sex offender. And there was another guy a few weeks ago, again, this was Samantha Otto. And Samantha, 5 years ago, threw boiling water in his boyfriend's or would-be boyfriend's face. He stalked him, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. Very, very male stalking behavior. And then what he did was he found the guy sitting in a gambling casino at a slot machine. He went into the kitchen, filled a cup with boiling water, yanked the guy's head back and poured the water on his face. A horrendous crime.
Wow.
And even though he didn't even have a GRC, as I know now, because he said he was a woman, our newspapers, the Irish Times, which is the leading broadsheet, the Sunday World, which is the main tabloid, both said woman who attacked man with boiling water, got a suspended sentence. Now, what happened then about 6 weeks ago gave these same newspapers a problem, because Samantha got into trouble again while under the suspended sentence. And it was a 3-year sentence, suspended for 5 years. The suspended sentence wasn't up yet. The suspended period wasn't up yet. He sexually abused a teenage lad in a laneway. Okay, while he's still on a suspended sentence. This time, he cupped his penis at him, whatever that actually means, cupped, but I don't know. But look, at his own penis, And so the newspapers could hardly say he cupped her penis, could they?
Yeah.
So how are they going to deal with this one? Well, the Irish Times dealt with it by saying nothing when this guy got sent to prison. The Sunday World dealt with it by saying who is trans identified, but didn't mention we never told you that last time, when it would say woman, when it headlines on woman. So when Otto got sentenced, it was quite disturbing that the judge said, Judge Codd, she says, because you're trans identified, you don't have a GRC. Well, that's a problem, because I'm going to have to send you to a men's prison. The obvious implication was he'd have been sent to a women's prison if he had the GRC. I don't know why he hadn't paid the 15 quid. Other interesting thing, and same story I saw with the paedophile 5-6 years ago. The judge said, you're going to find it hard going through prison because of your trans-identified nature. And I'm taking that into account in the sentencing. So our judiciary, the Judge Codd was completely clear, which said, giving you a lesser sentence. So a sex offender, or indeed any male offender, he's got a strong pragmatic reason to put on a dress and say, I'm not bad. So as far as I understand it, Otto is somewhere up in the men's section of the Joy right now. And I've actually made a podcast the other day outside Mountjoy Prison, talking to people just out again from both the men's and the women's, That's up there now, Paddy's podcast, Mountjoy. But I'm hearing up there that there is more sex offenders being put into Mountjoy for some reason now, presumably on their own bits. They keep them separately. But that's where he is now. And so, like, he didn't, it's like he changed sex, now that he... Now that he did. But our papers tie themselves in knots, our journalists do, by having pretended this was a woman. And like women are doing all these terrible things now, like throwing boiling water in their boyfriends' faces, that... And like,
just skews the figures, doesn't it? Absolutely skews
it does.
The figures, the crime figures to women.
And that's it. Like, and sorry, I know time's against us, but the medical profession does the same thing.
Yeah.
It's now recording men as women in the HIV figures, for example.
Right.
So we're getting, we're getting HIV surging, or at least rising among women, among heterosexual women. Of course, it's not. Or I had a little victory myself 3 years ago when I went to give blood, which I've been doing since I was 21 years of age. And they asked me this bizarre question about pregnancy. And I wrote back to them, and they eventually actually changed the website because it was saying, for cis men, trans women, are you now or have you been pregnant? I said, what's a pregnant transgender man? What's a pregnant transgender woman? And they did change it. But what that showed to me was the surrender of our medical services to the trans lobby again, that even the doctors themselves didn't know what it meant when I challenged them what it meant. So across the way, we've had come on, Bailey, that's me doggies coming up here. Across the way, we've had the surrender to the to the trans lobby, but above all, the journalists should be the front line, standing there for the public to tell the public what's really going on.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope we can talk in another 2 years' time, and things might have changed a bit.
Let's try that. Yeah. Okay. Right. So it's 45 minutes. That's perfect timing. Just let us know again one more time where people can find all your stuff.
Oh, there's on Spotify and all that. paddyspodcast.ie. It's free, and you could. But if you go onto the website gripped.ie, you'll see the interview with Barbie. A lot of the video, about 20 minutes of the video.
This is your article here, actually.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I also wrote an article in genspect.ie. I don't know if you've spoken to Stella O'Malley ever, who's a very, very good person. Yeah, Stella's website, Genspect, you know. I also wrote it up there in more detail, you know, so that's all there, Steve.
Yeah. And just to let people know, when you go on to paddyspodcast.ie, it says this is an insecure website, but it doesn't matter. Just click on it.
It says not secure. No, I just was dealing with getting an updated license, but they said, oh, that's something to do with when you go through HTTPS. It's not secure. Anyway, I'm not looking for money off of people. I'm going to see if I can get that.
There's no harm in doing it. I clicked on it and you can get straight there. Right.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Paddy. Right, shall we knock it on the head there? I'm sure.
Okay.
And let's do this again sometime in the future.
Yes, please. Let's keep in touch. I'm
going to be following things. I'm going to be following the Darlington nurses. I'm following Graham Linehan as well.
Yeah. I love your billboard, by the way. I realized you're the guy who goes around with the billboard on your.
Yeah.
That takes some courage. Well done,
yeah.
Steve.
I'll send you a link. I've just put a video out the other day where I got attacked when I was in Liverpool 6 months ago.
Yes.
So I'll send you a link to that. It's quite something. Paddy, thank you so much again for your time.
You're welcome.